Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. The cold, bitter wind bit against his face high above the ground. He was in an open biplane cruising at almost 100 kilometers an hour. Behind him, huddled in the plane, sat another man, doing his best to keep warm. As their faces risked frostbite, the vials of medicine stored near their bodies were kept toasty warm. Only a few days earlier, they had been enjoying hot meals and heated homes. Now, they were on a frigid, life-saving mission. I'm Craig Baird. This is Canadian History X, and today I share how those two pilots were part of a story that involved a lot of people who went above and beyond to save lives. This is The Race Against Death. It's December 1928, and Burt Logan had just arrived in his new home of Little Red River, Alberta, but he didn't quite feel right. Burt had spent the past few years working for the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories, which sat along the Mackenzie River. Now, during that time, Burt and his wife felt that they were as far from civilization as one could get. But their sacrifice and his hard work paid off. He received a promotion and a transfer to Little Red River, which was somewhat closer to civilization. They were now 550 kilometers south of Fort Simpson, but still pretty isolated. The only way in or out was by boat or foot. No planes, no trains, no automobiles. Before arriving at their new home, the couple took time to celebrate the promotion with a trip to Quebec to visit family and friends. But this meant their journey back west would be in the dead of winter. Now, as Burt unloaded their luggage, he was feeling progressively worse. He was cold and tired. At first, Burt brushed it off and blamed his malaise on the long journey from Quebec. But when his throat felt like he had swallowed broken glass and swallowing became difficult, he knew something was wrong. Burt's wife had training as a nurse and quickly realized he wasn't dealing with fatigue. She hoped her worst fears wouldn't be true, but her instincts told her she was correct. Burt had diphtheria. Today, thanks to vaccines, we often forget how dangerous diseases could be. Smallpox, polio, typhoid, they killed millions in their day, but their dangers have mostly been eradicated and they become a relic of decades gone by. Diphtheria is another biological boogeyman that once upon a time was highly contagious. It was caused by a bacterial infection that spread between people by direct contact, through the air, or through contact with contaminated objects. It also had a relatively high mortality rate of about 10%. Now today, the disease has mostly been eradicated with only about 4,500 cases worldwide. But a century ago, as Burt Logan unloaded his luggage from their trip to Quebec, diphtheria coursed through his body. During the 1920s, an annual estimate of 100 to 200,000 diphtheria cases and 13,000 to 15,000 deaths occurred in the United States each year, and Burt likely contracted it while in Quebec and carried it to his new home. Now, 5 years earlier, in 1923, veterinarian Gaston Roman discovered the diphtheria toxoid, a molecule capable of neutralizing the toxin produced by diphtheria bacteria. Within a year, he had developed the forerunner of today's vaccine. But in remote Little Red River, Alberta, there was little that could be done for Burt, and now the rest of the community was at risk of catching the disease. Their best hope would be inoculations. But there was a problem. Little Red River was 500 kilometers north of the life-saving medicine. Edmonton held their best chance of survival, and time was of the essence. Bert's wife asked local man William Gray and his son Bob to go immediately to Fort Vermilion to get Dr. Harold Rauman. Despite her own knowledge and correct diagnosis, she wouldn't be able to convince anyone in Edmonton to send medicine without a male doctor to back her up. And William and Bob took off on their 120-kilometer journey through the dead of winter on dog sled. They traveled on the frozen Peace River, testing the ice at various intervals, and reached Fort Vermilion 2 days later. They found Dr. Hammond and shared with him what Bert's wife had told them of his condition. The doctor immediately understood the gravity of the situation and traveled back with William and Bob to Little Red River. And by the time they arrived, Bert Logan was on death's door. His breathing was labored, and he was in and out of consciousness. And as Bert's wife sat by his bedside, Dr. Hammond made his assessment and confirmed her diagnosis. William and Bob waited, and soon they would embark once again on the next leg of the race against death. Dr. Hammond stayed in Little Red River as William and Bob Gray set out for Fort Vermilion to find Gus Clark so he could find men to take a 250-kilometer journey to Peace River's telegraph office so a message could be sent to Edmonton. 2 days later, William and Bob reached Gus Clark, who immediately found Joe Lafleur and William Lambert. Both men were very experienced in the bush, and they knew the area well. If anyone could make the journey south with haste, it would be them. Joe Lafleur and William Lambert boarded their dog sled on December 18th. They wore duck feather robes and bear hides to keep warm against the cold of Alberta's north. They carried no tents, and there'd be no warm beds and inns for them. Instead, they would be sleeping under the stars in temperatures that pushed past minus 40 degrees Celsius. They took potatoes and bacon, tea, sugar, and coffee and beef for nourishment, but their first run south got off to a bad start when Joe Lafleur went through the ice. William Lambert rescued him, but they had to race back to Fort Vermilion so Lafleur could recover from his near-death experience. And 3 days later, they left again, as temperatures hovered at minus 50 degrees Celsius. This time, they made the journey without mishap and arrived at Peace River on January 1st, 1929. Now, it may have been a holiday for everyone else, but they raced to the telegraph office to relay the message they'd been carrying with them for days. It said, "Logan, Hudson Bay man at Red River 50 miles below Fort Vermilion. Bad case diphtheria, voice gone, throat paralyzed, serum mold. Have started immunizing people around but quantity limited. Several known contacts 5 to 9 days ago with great possibility of spread. One other suspicious sore throat tonight. If possible, rush aeroplane. Good landing, no snow. If snow will clear landing strip on river, both Fort Vermilion and Red River. Radio message to me when to expect plane. Send incubation apparatus, several hundred antitoxin, Toxoid for 200. Cannot leave Logan's bedside. Real emergency, do all possible." As soon as the message was sent, both men went to the hospital to recover from severe flu, frostbite, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, back in Little Red River, there wasn't much to celebrate that New Year. The mood had been solemn since Bert Logan died on December 22nd. The town grieved the loss while worrying that the disease had spread and would strike them next. Most people stayed inside their homes in a self-imposed quarantine, and as Mrs. Logan lamented the death of her husband, Dr. Hammond waited patiently, not knowing if his message had reached Edmonton. Meanwhile, Bert Logan's burial had to be planned. Now, his wife didn't want to bury him in Little Red River. She wanted to take him back to Quebec, and she left with Bob and William Gray, as well as Dr. Hammond, and traveled south to Fort Vermilion with Bert's corpse. That journey stopped when a sudden blast of warm air, known as a Chinook, melted the river ice, which made it treacherous. The group had no choice but to return to Little Red River to wait for better weather. And as they re-entered the settlement, an RCMP officer told them they had to leave the body outside. Now, Dr. Hammond angrily protested and tried to convince the officer to let them in. Bert Logan would never make it to Quebec, though. Instead, his body was laid to rest at an Anglican cemetery nearby. As Bert Logan found his final resting place, things were happening 500 kilometers away. Dr. Hammond's message had reached Edmonton, and they knew time was of the essence. Medicine was needed in Little Red River, and getting it there by train or dog sled would be too slow. They needed a faster way. And for that, they turned to one of the most famous pilots in Canadian history. Wilfrid Reed May, better known as Wap May, was already a legend by the time Dr. Hammond's message reached Edmonton. He was born in Carberry, Manitoba in 1896 and moved to Edmonton in 1902. On the way, they stayed with family and friends, and his 2-year-old cousin, Mary Lumsden, could not pronounce Wilfrid and called him Wappy, which became his nickname, Wap. During the First World War, he joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force in February 1916, and although he started in the infantry, he dreamed of soaring high above the trenches as a pilot. He eventually applied to the Royal Flying Corps and became one of the Knights of the Sky. But he didn't have the best start. On his first training flight, he crashed his plane. His life as a pilot started out with a bust, but it wouldn't last. By April 20th, 1918, Wap May had been involved in his first aerial dogfight and lived to tell the tale. The next day, he entered another battle against a German squadron known as the Flying Circus, and their leader was Manfred von Richthofen. He was the deadliest pilot, and you might know him as the Red Baron. He was a formidable opponent, and because of May's inexperience, he was ordered to stay out of the fight and simply keep an eye out. At around 10 a.m., the squadron attacked a group of German triplanes, and at first, May circled above. But when he spotted a German plane doing the same thing, he launched into an attack. In the aerial skirmish, May chased the German aircraft that fled into the middle of the dogfight and fired on him. The plane he was chasing was piloted by Wolfram von Richthofen, the Baron's more inexperienced cousin. But high above the aerial melee, the Baron lurked, and when he saw his cousin in danger, he dove towards this brash young Canadian. Now, Wap May did his best to dodge the bullets of the more experienced pilot that had 82 aerial victories under his belt, but things were not looking good. May was pinned down and looked like he couldn't escape. That's when Canadian pilot Arthur Brown swooped in like a First World War Han Solo and took out the Baron's plane. As he crashed down, Wap May lived to tell the tale. The Baron did not. Ryan Lee is the curator of the Alberta Aviation Museum, and he says that May's legend grew from his interaction with the Red Baron.
Wap May said he didn't really know what he was doing as far as trying to, evade him. So he was flying very unpredictably. And, the Red Baron kind of got target focus and followed him over enemy lines, got chased down by another Canadian pilot, and, was eventually shot down by a combination of anti-aircraft fire and, possibly the other Canadian pilot. So he was almost killed by the Red Baron, and that was kind of his first claim to fame.
And for his part, Wap May agreed. Years later, he said he was only able to escape because of his own inexperience. He said, quote, "Richthofen was firing at me continually, and the only thing that saved me was my poor flying. I didn't know what I was doing myself, and I do not suppose that Richthofen could figure out what I was going to do." By the end of the war, May had figured out how to be a pilot, though. He shot down 15 confirmed German aircraft and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He returned to Edmonton in 1919, where he turned his attention to commercial pursuits. He opened May Airplanes Limited, a new venture that helped establish Canada's first airport, although calling it an airport is a bit generous. It was simply a landing strip in a farmer's field that became known as Mayfield. By September 1919, he was hired by the Edmonton Police. Now, Wap May would help in the manhunt of John Larson, who was accused of killing 2 men, one of whom was a police officer. He had fled the city, and Wap May would fly Detective James Campbell to find him. Together, they traveled 200 kilometers west to the community of Edson, where they found Larson hiding. But this wouldn't be May's last manhunt from the air, and we will get to that. Ryan Lee says that despite Wap May's passion and early attempts to make an aviation career happen, things slowed down, and he had to push to make his dreams come true.
But he had a real passion for it, and he always really wanted to bring aviation to the forefront here in Edmonton. So he was always petitioning politicians for, wanting a proper airport, for instance, for Edmonton. So it was largely through his efforts that he was able to convince the politicians to sponsor building a municipal air harbor here in Edmonton. And so aviation picked back up as that airport was built. The Flying Club was started in the same year, and largely through an effort from the the federal government sponsoring flying clubs. And a lot of people in Edmonton got interested in flying. And so that picked up back up in essentially 1927.
That year, Wat May formed the Edmonton and North Alberta Flying Club and became a flight instructor. By 1929, when Dr. Hammond's desperate plea for medicine reached Edmonton, there was really only one man that could help. Except, Wat May wasn't in Edmonton. He was 300 kilometers south in Calgary with his wife Violet. But his quiet day was interrupted by a call from Dr. Malcolm Bowe, the Deputy Minister of Health for Alberta. May was told the urgency of the mission and its life-saving consequences. And always ready for a new challenge, he immediately accepted. Within an hour, May was on a train traveling north to Edmonton. And when he got to the capital, he was met by Vic Horner, a longtime friend and companion for this mission. Now, Horner hadn't flown over the trenches like Wat May, but he had served his country. He was wounded at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, just as May was entering the war. And after the war, he joined May at the Edmonton Flying Club and became one of the most famous bush pilots in Canada. And a day after the SOS message from Little Red River had arrived at Edmonton, Wat May and Horner were on an Avro Avian. They took off on January 2nd, 1929 with their precious cargo. The departure was so quick that news of their heroic mission didn't even get out to the newspapers for 24 hours. And as the plane climbed into the sky, the two men crouched in the open cockpit, trying to escape the cold wind. Temperatures hovered around minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the only heat in the plane came from a coal heater, which wasn't a great idea. The blankets surrounding it soon caught fire and the heater was abandoned. So May and Horner had to keep the medicine warm above all else. So they placed the vials in their pockets, armpits, and groins to keep them warm. Ryan Lee says they flew for 3 hours on that first day, following the Edmonton, Dunvegan, and British Columbia Railway north.
This was long before any kind of radio navigation, well before GPS, obviously. So if you're not particularly familiar with flying from Edmonton up to the Peace River country, then you kind of need to look at a map and say, well, how do we get there? And the easiest way to do that is follow the rail line, which is what a lot of flights ended up doing. A lot of cross-country flights were always, there's an existing rail line and we can see it from the air, so let's just follow the rail line.
As darkness set in, they landed in McClellan for the night after covering 238 kilometers, and they were halfway to Little Red River. As the sun rose the next day, the two men took off towards Peace River to refuel. Now, there was no proper airfield, but a temporary runway was made on the ice-covered river, and landing was extra difficult because of the steel telegraph wires strung between the two riverbanks. And like the Millennium Falcon in an asteroid field, May's plane dodged wires, but they weren't out of danger yet. Upon touchdown, the plane slid on the ice towards the steel struts of the railway bridge, and with no other option, May pulled back and lifted off again. He flew under the bridge, turned around, and landed again in the opposite direction. Now, Wat May dodged those telegraph cables twice, just like he had dodged the Red Baron's bullets a decade earlier. And while the plane refueled, May sent a message to Edmonton to report on the journey. But what he didn't know was that the heroism was already being watched. As rural residents saw May and Horner fly over them, they sent messages back to Edmonton that were being picked up by newspapers. A new radio station in Edmonton, CJCA, provided regular reports of the Mercy flight to their listeners. In turn, the information was relayed by ham radio operators across Canada as newspapers filled their pages with May and Horner's journey. And after fueling up, the two men took off once again and reached Fort Vermilion at 3 p.m., just as a group from Little Red River arrived to greet them. And Wat May was so weak from the journey, he had to be helped off the plane by RCMP officers. Now, during the flight, the condensation from his breath froze his scarf to his face, and when he took it off upon landing, the skin of his lips came off with the scarf. And both men were suffering from frostbite. Oblivious to the pain, May and Horner handed over the much-needed medicine to Dr. Hammond, who was part of the group from Little Red River, and almost immediately, inoculations began in Fort Vermilion. That night, a dance was held to celebrate the heroic pilot's arrival, and anyone entering the dance hall had to pass an RCMP inspection to prove they'd received an injection of the serum. The next day, the Little Red River party set off north, and 2 days later they arrived to give everyone there the vaccine. In the end, Bert Logan was the only person to die from diphtheria, and in the heroic attempts, one person is sadly forgotten: Bert Logan's wife. In my research, which included scouring Ancestry.ca, I could not find her first name. At the time, newspapers referred to women by their husband's name, and without the quick thinking of Mrs. Bert Logan, the story would have had a tragic ending. Instead, her medical knowledge and quick thinking sparked what became known as the race against death, and it saved dozens of people. For their effort, Wap May and Vic Horner were called heroes. Once the medicine was delivered, they fueled up to begin the journey south the following day. But there was one major problem. Fort Vermilion had no aviation fuel, so they were forced to use automobile fuel, which got them to Peace River, but it wreaked havoc on the engine. They were grounded for 2 days in Peace River as repairs were done, and didn't make it home to Edmonton until January 7th, 1929. Ryan Lee says that Wap May and Vic Horner were greeted by an estimated 10,000 people when they finally returned from the heroic journey.
So by the time they got back to Edmonton, they were very tired, very exhausted, and very dirty and smelly. And there was, several thousand people there waiting for them, and a huge throng of media attention, which I don't think they were quite expecting when they got back.
People were so eager to congratulate them that they swarmed the plane as the propeller was still spinning. Wap May's wife Violet said years later, "Wap had to taxi the plane to the end of the field because the crowd was rushing the plane and he was worried somebody would be hurt by the propeller." That night, a massive civic celebration was held where May and Horner were presented with engraved watches. And Ryan Lee says the flight to Fort Vermilion not only saved lives, it also showed Edmonton and Canada the benefit of having an airfield. The race against death had made aviation history.
By the time, 3 years after the Mercy flight, 1930, there was an article in Maclean's said that Edmonton was the most air-minded city in Canada. And aviation wasn't unique to Edmonton, but really it was capturing people's attention so much that it was like, you know what, because of our unique geography, because of Wap May and how charismatic and how much he really pushed for this, it really put Edmonton on the map and made Edmonton a kind of a very unique center in Canada for how much they were pushing aviation. Because that captured people's attention so much, it really kind of was the tipping point in Edmonton for convincing the public that, hey, aviation is actually something pretty special and pretty useful for Edmonton, especially as that gateway to the north, or if you want to look at it from a northern perspective, gateway to the south. So connecting a lot of people from northern Alberta and northern Canada to larger population centers, materials, medicines, stuff like that.
So what happened to those involved in the race against death once people were saved? Dog sled hero Bob Gray lived a quiet life until his death in Edmonton on November 22nd, 1986. He was buried in Fort Vermilion, just like his father William, who had died 50 years earlier. Dr. Harold Hammond eventually relocated to Calgary and continued to work as a doctor for the rest of his life until he died on May 9th, 1987. And piloting hero Vic Horner continued to fly supplies and people to remote areas north of Edmonton for years after the race against death, and he passed away on Christmas Eve 1955 in Edmonton. As for his partner Wap May, he had a few more adventures ahead of him. Remember how early in his career he was hired by Edmonton police to aid in a manhunt? Well, he did it again in 1932 in what became known as the Hunt for the Mad Trapper. While serving a search warrant for illegal trapping on the Rat River, Constable King of the RCMP was shot and wounded by Albert Johnson, and the case became front-page news across the continent. Wap May took to the skies to help find Johnson, who had all but vanished. He took flight and searched the frozen ground below him. On February 13th, he saw Johnson's tracks on a river, and when the RCMP found him, a shootout erupted. In the firefight, one officer was seriously wounded. May landed on the frozen river, grabbed the officer, and flew him 201 kilometers to the doctor. His quick action saved the officer's life. And you can learn all about the story from my episode from late 2022, and I'll post a link in my show notes. Aside from those bush heroics, Wap May also played a critical role during the Second World War. He helped set up airfields across Canada as part of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. He then went on to train pararescue teams in the United States, which earned him the Medal of Freedom and the Bronze Palm in 1947. About 5 years later, Wap May was sadly grounded forever when he died of a stroke on June 21st, 1952, while hiking in Utah with his son Denny. But his name and legacy carries on. A rock on Mars in the Endurance crater is named after him, as is the Wapme Fault Zone west of Hudson Bay. And in 2017, the Fort Vermilion Airport was renamed the Wapme Memorial Airport in his honor. Now, as I mentioned earlier, not much is known about Mrs. Burt Logan after her husband's death, but I hope she lived a good life. She's the unsung hero of this story, and I wish she knew the impact her quick thinking had on two very different communities and hundreds of people. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the race against death. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.